Welcome everyone to another episode of the Friday's Times. I'll be your host today, Ayoub, and today we'll be chatting with Aurelien Mondon, who is a returning guest of the podcast, to talk about this concept of the populist hype. What we'll be focusing on today is the elections that are happening in Europe, in the UK, in France. Of course, the US is kind of the big elephant in the room in most of these conversations, so we'll of course talk about that too. And kind of ask the question of whether the far right is being reasonably, let alone responsibly covered in the mainstream media, i.e. like, is there a problem in the way it is covered in general, talked about in what we would call like mainstream discourse and so on. And the tentative title of this episode is going to be The Far Right is Not Inevitable, which I guess tells you a bit of where I land on this. But yeah, so let's start a bit with some intro, if that's okay, Aurelien. And after that, we'll do a kind of a brief overview of the populist hype for those who haven't listened to the first episode, and then we'll get into the main topic.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on the show. I'm Aurelien Mondon. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bath, and I've been working for about 15 years now on the mainstreaming of far-right politics. My original focus was really on the far-right itself. I worked originally on the French and Australian cases. But very quickly, I realized that actually what I was really interested in was not so much the far right itself, although that was an interest of mine, but it was really the way the far right is talked about and the way the process of mainstreaming takes place. Increasingly often to looking at the mainstream elite in particular and the role they play in enabling far right and reactionary politics. So what I mean by elite is the media, but also politicians, but also academics and intellectuals. So yeah, these are the things that I've been looking at in the past.
Thanks for that. You've been doing this as well for 15 years now, and I mean, quite a lot has changed in the past 15 years. It's a bit dizzying to be even when I say the past 15 years, because technically I have been covering Syria, for example, on and off for, well, over a decade now, and it does not feel real when I say it out loud, to be honest with you. But what is the problem with the populist hype, to put it kind of very mildly? Why are we quote unquote people in the media, and here like I want to be as broad as I can, but maybe we can narrow it in this conversation. Are we covering this phenomenon in a way that is, as I said at the beginning, reasonable, let alone like responsible?
No, I mean, not at all. I think the coverage of the far right is absolutely appalling, bar a few exceptions. And generally, these exceptions are to be found in the margins. I think the mainstream, what we could broadly call the mainstream coverage of the far right, and I'm not just talking about the right-wing media, I'm talking about also the liberal or left-wing media, has been utterly appalling for many, many years. What is most problematic to me really is that we are not learning any of the lessons that have been given to us over the years. We're not learning any of the lessons that are very historical. For example, we still haven't learned about what happened in the in the first part of the 20th century when we witnessed the rise of fascism. But we also haven't learned any of the lessons that have taken place in the last 40 years in the West and in Europe in particular, regarding the rise of the so-called rise of the far right and where it comes from, where it takes its roots, and so on. And it is absolutely frustrating to research this topic, because there is some very, very good research that has shown the roots of this issue, that have shown the problems with the coverage of this issue for a long time, and no one listens. I mean, I was struck, you mentioned that, it is dizzying to think about having worked on, you on Syria for a decade, and, me on the mainstreaming of the far right for 15 years. I was struck last week when I realized that one of the books that was incredibly influential in me deciding to do a PhD came out 20 years ago now. It's Annie Kollowald's Le populisme du FN, un dangereux contresens. Unfortunately, it was never translated into English, but a fairly kind of mainstream book in academia in France. It was published in 2004. Back then, Annie Kollowald was already telling us that using the term populism to talk about the far right was a huge mistake. We have learned nothing at all, to the point that the day we're recording this podcast, The Guardian put out another really terrible article on populism, hyping the far right. It is absolutely frustrating and really frankly depressing to see so little accountability and responsibility from journalists and academics.
I remember actually in your first appearance on this podcast, you mentioned that book as well. And I was thinking of The Guardian, because The Guardian published a piece about a week ago, I think, or more or less. I should say we're recording this on the 19th of June, 2024, talking about the AfD in East Germany, which, for those who don't know, is a far-right, basically neo-Nazi party in Germany that got its pretty highest percentage, I believe, in quite some time in terms of the recent EU elections. The title, even the headline of the article, was focusing on the rise of crime in East Germany as a big motivator for people voting for the far right. And the second thing that they focus on is like at the top of that article, I'll find it and put it in the show notes for those listening, is on like how they lowered the age of the EU to the age of 16, I believe, from 17 or 18 or something like that. That somehow explains like, oh, there's something going on in terms of why are so many young people voting for the far right in Germany. And at no point do they actually answer that question in any kind of meaningful way. For one, are there that many people on the young voting for the far right? Even that they don't answer. It's almost like there is this sense, that's a weird, bizarre thing right now. It's a bit of this Trumpian thing of like they are saying or people are saying, right? And we use that to almost, it drives an entire article, as we've been seeing time and time again in these platforms. The other thing is that, focusing again on the Guardian thing, there's very little self-reflection. And here I'm just using this one example because it's, to be honest, the most flagrant one, at least I've seen in a while, in Anglophone media, and at the very least. The French one is a separate problem. There's a self-reflection about like the author being herself like a white person living in Germany, of like, is she covering it from all of the possible angles? Even like, is she covering it quote unquote fairly? There's really zero self-reflection on any of that. And the obvious question of racism when it comes to a German far-right party doesn't even come up, or at least it does come up, to be entirely fair, in like a couple of sentences, like in the middle, buried in the middle of the article, which is a pretty long one. What do you make of that?
I think reflection is key, really. That's why I said, both reflection and accountability. There is zero reflection and there is zero accountability. And it's not just in the media, it's also in academia, right? Like, I mean, just a little anecdote here. With my colleague, Katie Brown, we wrote an article on the new populism series that The Guardian put out in 2019. We looked at all of their articles. We did some corpus linguistics, quantitative research on that to see which words were kind of prominent, how populism was used, how it was defined, and all of that. And what we saw in that so-called new populism series was that the use of populism was completely random, that it didn't follow really any strict academic definitions, even though they had academics, helping them. It was really kind of like sensationalist coverage. It was giving platforms to extreme right people like Steve Bannon, but calling them populists, even though, Steve Bannon at the time was really not popular at all. I mean, it was an appalling coverage, right? So we wrote that article, we, put it in, like, we put some quantitative stuff in that to kind of satisfy the colleagues who tend to think of discourse studies or more critical analysis as something that is, too politicized. And when we published it, the media team at our university told us like, oh, why don't we send it to The Guardian to see what they think? And we're like, yeah, sure, you do that, right? And they had contacts. So they contacted The Guardian and said, would you be interested in reading this article from our researchers? And they're like, oh, yeah, that sounds great and all of that. And, our media team sent the article to The Guardian and The Guardian never responded. So it's like, there is no willingness to even reflect on the damage they are doing. Instead, there is this self-righteousness of, we are the bulwark against the far right, we are The Guardian, we are the liberals, we are the kind of center-left, we don't like racists, but actually they do absolutely nothing to counter the rise of racism, or systemic racism for that matter. They do nothing to counter the rise of the far right. And the same thing is happening in academia as well. Something that I've always felt that links to what you were saying before about this inability to reflect on the whiteness of the people who still have a privileged access to shaping public discourse. We could talk about epistemologies of ignorance here, based on Charles Mills. This is still so prevalent in academia. So a couple of years ago, I took 5 years of all the articles published on the far right, the populist right, all of the kind of terms that I used to define these parties. 2,500 articles. I looked at the titles and the abstracts. Again, I did some corpus linguistics, looking at the words that were coming up, the words that were not coming up, and so on. And what I realized, it was incredibly euphemistic. So half of the articles had populism in their abstract or title. And out of 2,500 articles, only 13 mentioned whiteness in their title or abstract, which is absolutely appalling, right? We're talking about 2,500 articles about the far extreme right. No one talks about whiteness. Racism was mentioned in around 10% of the articles, which again is hardly surprising. Generally not in political science, of course, because apparently in political science, racism doesn't exist. The fact of the matter is that my field, far right studies broadly, which is not an official field, but anyway, we'll call it that, is very white, and it's very white for a number of reasons, the hierarchies in academia and all of that, but there's also better reasons why it's white, because it shouldn't be actually, people who are at the sharp end of the far right who should do the work of dismantling white supremacy. But at the same time, if the people who are doing this work are not engaging in their whiteness or in their various kind of privileged identities, then it's not going to go very far into challenging systemic oppression. This article got published. I know it got downloaded quite a lot, and it got zero engagement except for the people who already agreed with it. So the ability to turn a blind eye to anything that would challenge the status quo is amazing, to be honest. And we're seeing it today in France, in the last few days, the way Macron has been embracing the far right as a better ally than the left. And I think this is absolutely appalling. And we are going straight into the wall, 1920s, 1930s style.
That's the thing, right? I mean, just this morning I tend to take photos of headlines. I'm kind of obsessed with how they are framed, even in terms of the
I do that as well, yeah.
even in terms of like the photos that are used, because of course lots of editing is like all of that stuff. And so there was this, I don't know if it's today, but it's a recent one of Paris Match. And it says on the title, Gauche, Droite, la nouvelle bataille. So like left, right, the new battle. And you have on the left 3 figures of the left, quote unquote, and on the right, literally on the right, 3 figures of the right, including the far right. What's kind of amazing is that if you look at that, then you just say, you have 2 sides and they have, equal things to say. They have, pros and cons and whatnot. And effectively, this is a normalization of the far right. Like this in a headline, in a front cover. It has happened. And what's kind of bizarre is that we end up kind of seeing, and I've at least witnessed this a number of times, I don't know about your experience, a bit of a vicious circle. So I'll try and explain myself. We've known for a long time that there's been a problem, for example, with the coverage of Nigel Farage in the UK. A lot of the argument has been, those complaining about the coverage, is that why even are you giving this much platform to this guy? He failed to become an MP like 7 or 8 times or something in the UK. That was, in my opinion, of course, a very good argument, but it was pretty much ignored. And so he kept on being platformed time and time and time again. I think there's been lots of studies, and you probably know more than I do. Definitely has been my impression that he gets more coverage than many other politicians combined, even though he was never a prime minister, was never an MP, was never, all of that in the UK. He was a member of the European Parliament, even though he was one of the main protagonist of Brexit, and now he is running for elections in the UK, and suddenly the mainstream media can find itself justified in covering Nigel Farage again. And it's like, well, you've been doing this entire time anyway. Now it's almost like there's been this air of inevitability that this guy is going to be around us, is going to be around UK politics especially, let alone Western politics more broadly, because he's friends with Trump, because he's an architect of Brexit and all of that stuff. Even though they wouldn't, there's no one, for example, on the left that could be even remotely occupying that same kind of position. He's just someone who's on the left, but he's never been elected. No one actually likes him. Like popularity polls show him to be pretty unliked, but we're going to platform him all the time anyway and ask him his opinion about migrants or whatever. And now he is running. He may get some seats. I don't know. And then the mainstream media, of course, I'm thinking of the BBC specifically in this case, will be more than justified in its own reasoning and covering him again and again. Even more so, obviously, than before.
As I said, it's a vicious cycle. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's but I mean, what's fascinating about it as well is that I say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but actually, no. More often than not, it doesn't work. More often than not, they don't get the results that everyone expects them to, and almost hope them to. We had the same thing with Éric Zemmour in France in 2022. Completely constructed personality by Bolloré, one of the richest people in France. He owns a lot of the media now. Constructed Zemmour. There were opinion polls saying he would get to the second round, and he ended up with 7%, which, to be fair, is far too much, right? I mean, Éric Zemmour is an incredibly extreme right politician. He's homophobic, he's misogynistic, he's racist. He's really, really bad. So 7% is too much, but he was hyped so much. It's incredible and completely constructed, not just by Bolloré, who is an extreme right kind of media mogul, but also by the mainstream media, right? He was constructed as like the kind of clown on the side that we invite, but of course, he creates some shock, but at the same time, that legitimizes his ideas as actually worth debating, worth being part of the public debate, which is really, really bad news from my views and yours, obviously, as you were saying with that Paris Match headline. With regard to Farage, I mean, it's completely appalling. And I had an article published yesterday, actually, in the conversation on this, kind of talking about the Farage hype. Farage has never been popular by any stretch of the imagination. Again, completely created as a personality, as a political and media personality. He's been allowed to shape the agenda in ways that, as you said, no one on the left would ever be able to. He hasn't been vilified the way he should have been vilified, while you had people like Corbyn, like Diana Abbott, who were vilified for whatever kind of tiny mistakes they would make. Nigel Farage, I mean, like there are articles about the people who knew him when he was a kid, and he was, again, like incredibly extreme right, talking about fascism and things like that. And it's amazing that he is still there. He has proven to be quite a useless strategist. Of course, there's been more useless than him, which is the Conservative Party. Just to think that in 2014, so 10 years ago, and again, that's you can see the history, like you can see history repeating itself here. In 2014, EU elections, both the Front National at the time, now called Rassemblement National, and UKIP won in the UK and in France. UKIP won with 26.6% of the vote. It's an earthquake, it's a tidal wave, it's whatever kind of exaggeration you want to find. But it's the EU elections. But EU elections are second-order elections. Usually there's a very low turnout. The people who turn out to vote tend to vote for things that are generally kind of protest votes in many ways, because people don't really see that the EU is going to have an impact on their day-to-day lives. And also, of course, if you're a far-right party that is campaigning on hating the EU, you have an easy message. Well, if you're a party that's not against the EU, it's much harder to kind of sell it, because the EU is not exciting and it's far from perfect. In fact, it's extremely problematic and so on, right? So you have like this incredibly fertile environment for the far right. And you have UKIP that does 26.6% of the vote, which seems huge, right? A quarter of the vote. But then again, it's only a quarter of the vote when all the other parties were not campaigning on leaving the EU. All the other parties were campaigning on staying in the EU, reforming it, changing it, whatever, but no one except UKIP was campaigning on leaving the EU. And that's this vote that leads then Cameron to promise the referendum, right? So this referendum is made on the promise because a quarter of the vote went to UKIP. But actually, if you look at the registered vote, which is all the people who could vote in the UK at the time, UKIP gets only 9.5% of the registered vote. And that doesn't include the people who couldn't vote, but it doesn't include the 17-year-olds. That doesn't include people like me who couldn't vote because I'm not British, but live there and pay taxes and things like that. That doesn't include a ton of people who are not registered and so on, right? But so less than 1 out of 10 voters voted for UKIP, voted for Farage, voted for, and I'm saying voting for Farage because of course they didn't vote for Farage himself, but voted for Farage because he was the face of it. And he is allowed to drive the next 10 years of British politics, to force Brexit through, to force a far-right Brexit through in particular. Again, it's not an argument about Brexit or staying in the EU or not, but the project was a far-right one, whether we want it or not. And 10 years later, what do? We do it again, right? We just hype him. There's like one little poll that says is like, yeah, reform is quite high. It's only one poll. Since then, the new polls have said that actually they're not quite as high as that poll was suggesting, and certainly no higher than the Conservative Party, even though the Conservative Party is at an incredibly low point. But there you go. Farage is being hyped, and now is being touted in some of the media as the next leader of the opposition. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And as you said earlier on, it's blamed on the people as opposed to being blamed on the elite coverage of the far right.
That's the thing, and that's what I think is. I do think, like, it's fair to say it's genuinely misunderstood by a lot of people, including people who genuinely mean well. And I'm not talking about like people in elite circles that were calling them, but just everyone else that I can think of. This is not a new phenomenon in of itself, obviously, as you've mentioned yourself. I'm reading this biography, or at least it's a kind of a cultural studies history of the UK, or post-war UK especially, focusing on Ian Fleming and the Beatles as like two poles of post-war Britain. One of the interesting things about Ian Fleming, a creator of James Bond, for those who don't know, is that, he was this very rich, upper-class guy connected to a bunch of prime ministers and whatnot. And what's interesting is that the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Anthony Eden, was responsible for the Suez Crisis, for those who don't know. When he things got a bit heated, and I think he started, from what I understand, like things were not going well for him in the war, and for those who don't, trying to basically invade Egypt, he went to Ian Fleming's real estate in Jamaica, which was called GoldenEye, for those who don't know, and stayed there for like a week or so, and then returned to the UK, and shortly after was basically forced to resign. That was an interesting tidbit for me because it kind of revealed that there is this essentially upper class, world in which they mostly speak to one another. And this reflects, obviously, if we talk about the cover, Ian Fleming, I should say, the reason I mentioned it's not just James Bond, is that he was also a journalist for one of the main papers at the time. I forgot which one, the Telegraph or the Times or something. And this reflects a lot in, of course, the priorities and the focus and like what gets even covered in the first place. So fast forward to today, I mean, Farage, again, is an interesting example for me because he is someone who has, as you mentioned, driven the past 10 years essentially of British politics because David Cameron or someone around him or whatever decided that this is what they need to be focusing on. In the same way right now, we're seeing Macron, as you mentioned, appealing to the far right. I saw yesterday or 2 days ago making basically a transphobic comment and stuff like that. It doesn't matter whether this one person actually believes, like Macron himself believes in this or not. The point is that someone or himself or his team or whatever, because those people pride themselves in having a research team or whatever, people around him who are educated and know things, have concluded that basically this is the way to go. Like, if you want to win against the far right, you need to concede, 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever, to kind of their discourses and what they're saying, and what is it that they're focused on right now, what is it that they're obsessed with right now. Yeah, a combination of basically transphobia, which is what's in vogue right now with the right wing and the far right, and of course the usual anti-immigration, anti-Islam, anti all of that stuff, which in and of itself is not new. It's just taking this kind of on steroids now. He decides that, probably, clearly thinking that it's not going to go through. There is a clearly, we can get into this forever, and it's not kind of the focus of this particular conversation. The coverage of what Brexit actually means, I also think, was quite appalling. I was in London at the time, and I was kind of obsessed with, as I mentioned, with taking photos of headlines. So I was reading the daily ones on a pretty regular basis. And there was very little talk about what would it actually mean to me personally as a British citizen or resident or whatnot if we leave the EU and whatnot. Rather, it was, again, platforming the big names. Again, Farage being the obvious one in this case, the infamous him in front of a big billboard of migrants behind him. Of course, the infamous £350 million to the NHS that Boris Johnson and others were pushing, and so on and so forth, with very, very little self-reflection as to is any of this even remotely factually accurate? And if it is not, why are we covering it in the first place? Because there was this notion that, we need to represent both sides, quote unquote, even though 5 seconds ago, before David Cameron announced that this is what's going to happen, there were no both sides. They didn't exist. Those were not things that were in the mix. And the immediate polls around the time, if I remember correctly, the details, I'll get them wrong, but this is roughly accurate, of when David Cameron made that announcement, very few people in the UK percentage-wise were thinking about the EU at all. They were thinking about stuff like, rent and the NHS crisis and stuff that most people, to be honest, think of on a daily basis, because why wouldn't they? And yet this was basically what became a identity. Literally, you became a Remainer or a Brexiteer. And then there is the hard Brexit, the soft Brexit, and this became the discourse shifted seemingly overnight, at the very least in a matter of months, to not just should it happen, or, okay, it did happen, is there something wrong with how it happened? No, it did happen. This is now the new law of the universe, and we're going to debate how we're going to make it happen. Is it going to be really bad, or is it going to be catastrophic? And those were basically the two options, and there was no space anymore for anything else.
Exactly, precisely, right? And in a way, I think, I don't think that was planned, right? I don't think there was a grand plan to kind of achieve this kind of complete blockage of anything political, right? But even in terms of policy, nothing could happen anymore. Even for the Tories, they couldn't do anything but talk about this. So I think many of them probably were not very happy about it. But I don't think there was a grand plan. But I think it kind of worked very well for them, because Corbyn had to talk about Brexit all the time, and he wanted to talk about something else, And again, I'm not a Corbynite myself. I think, in fact, that Corbyn wasn't particularly radical, and not as radical as I would have wished him to be at this time, and I think he made a number of mistakes as well. But the fact that the whole kind of public space, the whole public discourse was exhausted by Brexit and by this very silly debate between Remain and Brexit, which were as you said, terrible alternatives anyway, that didn't go to fixing any of the crises that were facing either the UK or the EU, prevented politics from happening. It was completely anti-political in many ways. And, this is what happens a lot. And, for Brexit, I don't think it was necessarily planned like this, but I think we can see it at times where I do think it is a conscious move by some mainstream elite to kind of divert attention. And I think, transphobia is a key one. Transphobia was not an issue 5 or 6 years ago. No one talked about it. I mean, it was an issue for trans people, don't get me wrong. Trans people were facing transphobia day in, day out, right? That's not what I mean. But in terms of public discourse, right?
Yeah, a political issue at a national or whatever level, yeah.
Exactly, right? And in fact, I was chatting yesterday to my colleagues who are doing some great work on anti-gender politics, Gavin Titley and Fran Amery. If listeners are interested, they should check out their work on this. And we were chatting about it. And Gavin, in the research that he's been doing with his colleagues on the anti-gender movement, was saying that, even in 2018, Suella Braverman, I think it was 2018, Suella Braverman, for example, was quite positive towards trans rights. Keir Starmer was quite positive. Emmanuel Macron was quite positive until recently about trans rights. And then you see them flipping and they start talking like the biggest TERFs, the biggest transphobes, saying things that are absolutely outrageous by any kind of even liberal standard, to be honest.
Yeah.
And you can see how they're using that as a moral panic, right? It's textbook moral panic. And in fact, Fran Amery and I used the concept of moral panic in an article we wrote recently on transphobia as a reactionary movement, and looking at the way, in a way, transphobia is used, and the lives of trans people are used as a political football to serve the interests of the status quo and divert away from the various crises that are taking place. At times, I really wonder, and this is something that I've chatted about with another colleague who's doing his PhD currently, Alex Yates, on anti-populism. Like we were chatting about whether this is all a game to some of these people, right? When you look at some of the opinion pieces that are written by pundits in the media about all of this, like, oh, why don't we give the Rassemblement National a shot and see what happens? They'll probably be horrible and then they'll lose. It's like, but don't you realize that there are people's lives at stake here? Don't you realize the damage this is doing to people directly, but also indirectly by legitimizing certain discourses, by legitimizing the idea that some people shouldn't be here, shouldn't be able to dress the way they want, shouldn't be able to act the way they want, shouldn't be able to be called the way they want, to use the pronouns they want, and so on. To them, it's a game because they are so insulated. And they look at it like it's all a bit of fun, really. And you can see sometimes this kind of morbid enjoyment in the liberal elite at seeing the far right at the door. They know full well that they are not going to be at the sharp end of far right politics, right? In fact, most of them will be very happy to kind of join ranks eventually, but they just get a bit of a kick, I think, pretending that, the far right's at the door and they are the keepers of the good liberal democracy. And that takes us back to accountability. I think we live in a system currently where public discourse is in so few hands that it leads to an incredibly poor quality, but also an incredible narrow-mindedness in what is being discussed. And then in turn, that mediates the way people think about politics and, the fact that most people are completely disillusioned. They distrust most institutions for very good reasons, but also the fact that when they go to the ballot box, well, when they think about the issues that are facing the country, well, they think about the issues that they see day in, day out in the media, day in, day out on their political leaflets and so on, instead of thinking about the issues that they are facing themselves. And that's why, when you look at opinion polls, and I've done some work on this based on the Eurobarometer, when you look at opinion polls, there's a massive discrepancy between what people think is an issue to their country and people think what is an issue to themselves personally. So when they think about their country, all the kind of big reactionary issues are higher up. They're not necessarily at the top, but they're higher up. Immigration, for example, is quite high, but it's not always top. But when people think about their day-to-day lives, immigration doesn't rate. No one cares about immigration. When people think about their day-to-day lives, they care about issues that the left has answers to. They care about pensions, they care about cost of living, they care about education, they care about jobs, they care about all the things that the far right and the liberal center have no answers to. They care about the polycrisis. They know that things are going badly and things will get worse unless we have radical change, but instead their attention is diverted onto moral panics, scapegoats, and completely depoliticized, really.
So recently I had this conversation with Bill McKibben, who's this, I would call him like an elder in a quasi-spiritual sense, but he's an elder, like he's an African-American activist and writer and intellectual in the US. Bill McKibben Jr. this like I think 10 episodes ago or so on, for those who want to listen to that one. And we spoke about this notion, and here I will echo a bit of that conversation in what I'm going to say here about, you mentioned the folks who were saying that about, let's give it a shot with the Rassemblement National, see what happens and whatnot. And there are two things that this reminds me of, or this at least makes me think. One, it does remind me of the notorious, well, for those who are a bit like me, obsessed with European history up until 45 or so, 1945 or so, which is, after Hitler, us. And this notion that like, we'll have him, this Adolf guy, we'll have him a chancellor or whatever, but he's clearly a buffoon. He's rabidly anti-Semitic. Most Germans are, well, to be honest, most Germans there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism, but not as much as Hitler, clearly. But he's this buffoon. He yells a lot and whatnot. He's going to discredit the Nazi party, obviously, so badly that after they collapse because they're so absurd, we will take power. And that was basically the argument that many, especially conservatives at the time, did, endorsing if not tolerating, or tolerating if not endorsing Hitler. And of course, we know what happens next, but this is kind of the bizarre thing about, history is hindsight, or hindsight is 2020 or whatever, is that there's a bit of this assumption when we make that kind of, when we look at history like that almost like this was inevitable, right? Like there is this sense that, oh, well, this happened, and then we know what happened next, and we can almost make a jump between like the 30s and of course the liberation of France, or the end of the World War II, and the discovery of the extermination camps and the Holocaust and so on. It's almost like this is now one chapter of history, but of course at the time it was not seen as that. At the time it wasn't seen as like, this is what's going to happen next, this is what's going to happen in 5 years or whatever. Every day there was new developments. Every day people, especially in power, were making specific decisions that could have turned things in different ways, of course. And I mention this because The argument about those who are basically either saying it out loud or effectively implying it in their coverage, or especially in what they choose not to cover when it comes to the far right in France, is that, we'll find out what they do. It's going to be a number of years, and clearly if they're so bad, they will not be re-elected. But this assumes a few things. It assumes, one, that the far right will play by the rules and they will just leave after being unpopular. And two, it assumes that what you think of as France will be the same in 4 or 5 years. That there is this eternal thing called France or the UK or the US or Weimar Germany or whatever. And, there are like waves, so a bit on the left, a bit on the right, a bit on the center. The center has collapsed. The left isn't, quite there. And I'm talking about how this is, I think, is usually perceived. And so we're going to try the far right and see what happens, essentially, almost as if like we need to tolerate them for them to redress something. But then, of course, the question, as you mentioned very well, and this is what we talked about with Bill McKibben, is like, who the fuck is the we here? Who are we talking about? Who is the we that we're saying we will just tolerate them? Because obviously, if you are a migrant or a Muslim or pretty much quite a good chunk of the population in France, for example, the next 4 years will very likely, if they do win a significant percentage, change your entire life in ways that you may have no control over, or at the very least you will find yourself much more in the defensive, let's say, than you would have otherwise if they had not won this kind of, this percentage or whatever. I mentioned this because there is this bit of it's almost like the word that comes to me is almost mediocrity. It's almost like it's not taken seriously until it's basically too late not to take it seriously. And even then, you'll have people who either always justify to themselves that they were never on the wrong side or whatever, or you'll have people who just jump on the opportunity and see that the overtone window has shifted more to the far right, and either maybe they were, let's say, pro-trans rights before, and now, maybe they won't be vocally anti-trans rights, but they will choose not to say anything about it and let things be, essentially. And to the, of course, horrible consequences to folks who are actually trans.
Yeah, absolutely. This is it, right? I mean, you say mediocrity, and there is that. I think there's a comfort in mediocrity, because I think, people who are in these positions of power, they know they're not going to be challenged by their peers, right? Because they would have too much to lose if they allowed themselves to be challenged by each other, right? So that's why they kind of tend to close ranks, and you see that quite a lot. You see that in the media, you see that in politics, you see that in academia, and you see that amongst themselves as well. You see that they'll come to each other's kind of support if someone criticizes them in many ways. I think there's a couple of points in what you were saying. The ahistorical nature of our public discourse at the moment is actually mind-blowing. So of course, we hear lots of pundits talk about like history in very naive and mediocre way as well. I guess mediocrity was a good word that you used there, where they'll talk about like Dunkirk, and they'll talk about like this kind of events without actually understanding the context of the time, without actually understanding the broader politics, and of course whitewashing what was happening in their own countries as well. The idea that we won the Second World War if we were British, French, American, forgetting, of course, that anti-Semitism wasn't just very present in Germany, but also in these countries, and that, they like Hitler was not only tolerated in Germany by the center, but also in many other countries, and so was Mussolini. But this has quickly been forgotten, obviously, and we've triumphed over fascism and Nazism, and then we have a post-racial world that is born of the so-called, obviously, post-racial world that's born, and so on. And what's incredible is the arrogance, I think, of the people who are leading this system. And I'm not talking about kind of leading this system as a coherent, minority or anything like this, but the people who are in positions of power and shaping public discourse in a way. There's this arrogance that, to me, became incredibly clear, both incredibly clear and frustrating, in the concept that liberalism and liberal democracy would be a bulwark against the far right. Not only was this idea completely ahistorical, because, as you said very rightly, liberalism was no bulwark against the far right or the extreme right or Nazism and fascism in the 1920s and 30s. In fact, it enabled it, as you said, thinking that Hitler would be a puppet and could be gotten rid of quickly. But also, like, if we look since the Second World War, or even before the Second World War and before Nazism, liberalism, more often than not, and I'm talking about really existing liberalism, which is something that I published on recently in an article on Constellation, where I talk about really existing liberalism as an enabler of reactionary politics as opposed to a bulwark. If you look at really existing liberalism, many of the reactionary politics that are now considered extreme, that are considered outside of liberalism, were in fact very much accepted by liberalism. And when these policies were challenged the liberal elite of the time was against giving more rights to the people who were challenging the hegemony of the time. Think about women's rights, think about same-sex marriage, think about workers' rights, all of these kind of things. The liberal elite of the time was against these kind of changes quite often. There's this idea that history ended in 1990, and I know that Fukuyama has been widely discredited. Most people would think that he was wrong, and that's not the case. Even himself, has said it, although he said it in a way that I also disagree with, as much as I disagree with his first hypothesis. But regardless, most people would disagree with his statement that history ended in the early 1990s, and yet it's still gripping our political elite and our media elite and our academic elite. Like, no one is thinking that there could be something beyond liberalism. And that has led to two things, from my point of view. That has led, to the idea that the far right, we can play with it. Again, it doesn't matter because it's never going to go anywhere. Institutions will protect us. And we can see very clearly that institutions will not protect us. You can see that with Roe versus Wade, for example, in the United States. You can see that some of the policies that have been put in place and implemented with regard to immigration, to refugees and things like that, to trans people, and so on. So, I think there's a complete kind of like naivety about the idea that liberalism will withstand the rise of the far right. But that also plays another role, which is preventing us from thinking about radical alternatives beyond the liberal hegemony on the left as well. And the idea that there may be things that could be taken from liberalism, but I think there's plenty of things that should be left as well, because they haven't worked and they are completely unable to help us answer the challenges we are facing at the moment. We are living in an exhausted hegemony. It will crumble, things will change radically. And at the moment, I think it's the far right and the extreme right that has their duck in a row, right? And what you can see is that liberalism or the liberal elite, and I'm not talking about liberalism as an ideal, because I'm not interested in it, to be honest. I'm interested in really existing liberalism. Really existing liberalism and the really existing liberal elite is they're far more comfortable with the far right future than they are with radical change coming from the left, because they know they have far more to lose as well.
Yeah, no, exactly that. I mean, Dunkirk was like a week or so ago, and there was this big controversy, whatever, because Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister of the UK, soon to be former Prime Minister of the UK, left a bit early or whatever. But for me, I mean, that was a shitty move anyway. But for me, I listened to some of the speeches of the folks who were there, Macron included, of course, and Ursula von der Leyen and a bunch of the others. And I found those to be as nauseating as the person who left, to be honest with you. There is a very much this stench of hypocrisy, as you mentioned, like who were we, where were we, as a nation or whatever during World War II. It reminds me of Stéphane Hessel. He was a part of the resistance in France, lived to his 90s or something. And he said there was this interview that he surfaced that at least I saw a few days ago. I know it's like from a decade or 2 decades ago, more or less. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. And he said that people in France keep on saying that like we, France, resisted the Nazis. But that's not true. The resistance was actually a minority. France was Vichy. France was Vichy France. And a lot of people in France, especially by the end of World War II, were complicit, either active, if not, or maybe passive, with the Nazis. It kind of became this, the new rule of the game or whatever. And he was basically making this argument that like the people that we say, France resisted the Nazis. And it is, of course, ahistorical. It doesn't mean that there weren't loads of French folks who did resist Nazis. Of course there were, either in exile or within France itself, which was, in many ways more dangerous, either in the occupied territories or in the free territories. But the point is that the narrative was then reconstructed after World War II, because obviously there were the very obvious bad guys, and it's not complicated to see why the Nazis would be the bad guys in the story. And so by contrast, you needed the good guys rather than the very messy guys. The very morally messy guys. That ultimately what defeated Adolf Hitler was the British Empire, the French and the USSR, three quasi or if not existing empires that, had a lot of blood on their hands as well. With what I'm saying, the point isn't then to make a moral equivalency between the two. That's not the point. The point is to look at how were the stories then built after the World War, Second World War in this case, in France. We're talking about this post-war kind of status quo, which obviously is a bit the backbone of what we're calling in many ways also the liberal order, whatever. And how much of that is self-serving and how much of that is today obscuring complicity, as we're saying, Macron being the obvious one here, with the far right, or Ursula von der Leyen being actively pursuing an alliance with Meloni today. All of these things are happening as we're seeing, and it's almost like there's a unspoken, I don't know, but a sort of an agreement between, let's say, Ursula von der Leyen and folks around Meloni, if not Meloni herself, that like, we will agree to disagree on certain things, but those of us who agree more to disagree on them. So, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, who maybe is not personally transphobic, will not come to the defense of trans people if Meloni goes after them, more actively, as I think she very likely will, or at least might. Or especially with migrants. Ursula von der Leyen is most these days, in my circles in any case, notorious for being one of the architects of what we call Fortress Europe, which has led to the deaths of so many migrants that I don't think we even have numbers, but it's in the tens of thousands in the Mediterranean or on Europe's land borders. And this is what, in this narrative, going to Dunkirk and whatnot, is like this is what's representing right now the people who inherited the entities that defeated the fascism, that defeated Nazi Germany and Mussolini and whatnot. And of course, for me, it's not just like insulting on a kind of moral basis, but it makes it more dangerous because it takes up so much space and so many resources are occupied by those folks and by, of course, through their connections to the media and so on, that those of us who are trying to kind of focus more on the threat at hand, which is in this case the far right and fascists, spend so much time actually debunking existing things in the media, essentially ourselves being on the defensive when we shouldn't be on the defensive, if you see what I mean. Yeah, this is, I feel, where we're at right now. It's not very, I also am a bit pessimistic, although in keeping in line with the title of this episode, that the far right is not inevitable, I want to say a few things, but I'll let you first reflect on what I said, if you mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I totally agree. I think, the exceptionalization of Nazism, the exceptionalization of far-right politics has always been a key issue in the resurgence of far-right politics. The idea that Nazism were evil, and to use the terms used by Robert Meister, after evil, that, they were evil, we defeated them, we're fine now, it's all good, they were very secluded, it was just the Germans and all of that. That has had a terrible effect, right? Because it was quite useful for the Reconstruction period in France, for example, and in various other countries. It made people feel good about themselves, and, it allowed to kind of go over divisions that were really present in French society in the post-war period, as you were saying. But of course, it backfires because it leaves this shadow. All of a sudden, you're not able to face your demons, right? You're not able to face colonialism. You're not able to face, same for the UK, right? I mean, where, the concentration camps were trialed, during the Boer War, for example, which, was conveniently then ignored afterwards. Again, rejected only onto the Nazis, doing these kind of things. It couldn't be us. I said, I mean, I don't think we need to go very far in history books to find out, what the empires that ended up to be on the right side of history during the Second World War were doing, even during the Second World War and after the Second World War. Again, all of this has been kind of whitewashed, forgotten, and so on. I mean, look at the way France talks about, or doesn't talk about, the Algerian War, for example. I mean, talking about the French resistance, I always find that fascinating because I was born in France, I was educated in France, and I was taught all of this kind of stuff, and I just accepted it, right? I'm not ashamed at all saying it, that I had accepted these kind of narratives about France, about the Republic, about universalism, and I was lucky enough to be able to get out of France, to be honest, and to meet the right people when I got out of France, and to have this kind of distance from the society in which I grew up, to be able to realize that actually the history that I'd learned at school was politicized, right? And wasn't just facts, and wasn't just as simple as it was meant to be. And, resistance to me, like looking at the resistance from outside of France and looking at the resistance as well in a more critical way, was kind of fascinating and eye-opening as someone who had been taught this from a very young age. And I realized that, as you said, the resistance in France was very small. I mean, apparently, studies have shown that, there would be between 1% and 2% of the people who would have resisted, and similarly 1% and 2% of the people who would have collaborated actively, and the rest would have been either passive collaborators or passive resistance, or whichever way you want to call them. But even the 1% to 2% of the people who would have resisted were incredibly divided, right? So you had the communist resistance, of course, which was against Nazism. And for example, there were some people who really insisted in that communist resistance. There's this very famous line of, I never killed a German, I only killed Nazis. So the focus was on ideology, not on nationalism. But at the same time, you had resistance on the right who were anti-German. They didn't really care about the Nazi part. They cared about, the Germans invading France. And so some of them were actually openly anti-Semitic as well. They were just upset that France was invaded by Germany. And so all of this kind of complicates everything again, and you can add to this the fact that many resistance, and some of the most active resistance, were foreigners and were Jews as well, right? And, one of the most famous cases that made the news recently was Manoukian, who ended up being moved to the Pantheon in Paris. Manoukian was called a terrorist during the Second World War. He ended up being killed alongside 27, I think, resistance. Most of them, I think there was only one French man amongst them, and there was one woman amongst them as well. They were all captured and killed. They were the most active resistance group in France at the time, completely vilified, of course, by the Vichy regime and so on, and mainstream society, but incredibly brave people. And then they ended up being kind of like turning into heroes later on. But then Macron decided to move them to the Pantheon, and he was invited Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen. He was a Pétainiste. He was, a Holocaust denier. And, Macron was totally fine with that. I mean, to me, it is mind-blowing. And, it's what you say about von der Leyen as well. As an academic, I am not interested in the psychology of these things. But as an individual, as someone interested in politics and history, I am interested in how do these people manage to reconcile their positions? Because to be honest, you were saying that before. Like, I don't know where they stand actually on these issues. The kind of more centrist elite, von der Leyen, Macron, and all of that. I don't know. I just wonder sometimes how they manage to just reconcile their completely opposed positions of going to Dunkirk to celebrate anti-Nazism, anti-fascism, and then enabling it. It's just weird.
If I can offer, it's going to be a partial answer also because we're going to slowly wrap up here. But I think with Ursula von der Leyen, for example, again, very similar to you. I mean, there's no way I can prove this. It's just like my personal observation based on my own kind of obsessive focus on the far right as well here in Europe. But I think there is a bit of a I'm going to weather the storm. I represent a certain idea or whatever, and then that idea itself can be very flexible. And that, for example, if I manage to bring, me Ursula, if I manage to bring Meloni into an alliance with me, then I might serve as a moderating force, for example, which would be good for Europe because of course Meloni was very anti-Europe before being elected, even pro-Putin and all of that stuff. And then after being elected, she quote unquote toned down the rhetoric. And right now is, pro-Zelensky, for example, or at least pro-Ukraine, anti-Putin and whatnot, because she is, I think, pretty cynical, if not smart, because in these circles that counts as smart politician. And Ursula von der Leyen finds something appealing about that. Again, I think the specifics of what it is that they, for example, disagree on maybe matter if they're having an internal, a one-to-one conversation. But I think when it comes to, for example, abortion rights with, von der Leyen I think, if I'm not mistaken, is in favor, but Meloni is notoriously not. This might just not be the hot button issue for Ursula von der Leyen personally, and that might be the extent of how much she's thinking about this. Or she says that, I imagine there's a lot of rationalization that happens when it does happen, but otherwise I don't know if it basically on a day-to-day basis, it has to happen, because I don't think they're surrounded by people who tell them these things necessarily. And not to say that they're many people like to think this about Trump, that he's just this idiot who doesn't know what's happening, he's just being told things by people around him. I don't think that's true. I think it's basically somewhere in between. You mentioned that even The Guardian did not read the report that you guys worked on for so long. You mentioned that report as well, that study, that you mentioned in the previous episode as well that you were on. And I do think it's, very similar probably with someone like her, that maybe she hears criticisms here and there, but she will also hear so many more comments around her, approving her and supporting her and saying you're our last chance maybe. I don't know. I imagine all of these things happening pretty regularly. And it doesn't have to get anywhere else, in that sense, because they don't need to read the articles of people who are criticizing them or the papers by academics who, and whatnot. They just need to be around people who already do, or if they aren't, an existential threat to their own political careers or whatever. That's kind of how I picture it in any case.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. And I think, there are more than enough people around them to, and I see that even on a daily basis in academia as well, often see people playing the hierarchy, trying to climb up and therefore refusing to kind of challenge anyone, all of these kind of things. I think this is what the system is the system we live in a way is all about, right? And this is how neoliberalism has thrived.
We can do this forever. Okay, let's end on a relatively hopeful note of when I say the far right is inevitable, what do I mean by that? And I've mentioned this a few times, but I do think it bears repeating. It is important to mention this. There's nothing that's happening right now that is inevitable. Even on a very basic, fundamental human level, we're talking about political actors, we're talking about people making specific decisions on a day-to-day basis. They have people around them, they are listening or reading specific polls made by specific people and whatnot. And then they're basically saying certain things to the media or not saying other things to the media. Maybe saying certain things on social media compared to what they would say on TF1, or France 24, France 2 or BBC or whatever. that doesn't have to be the case, in the sense that if you are a journalist, if you are a reporter, if you are a commentator, an activist, an academic, and whatnot, and you're looking at all of this, I do think it is very important not to believe the populist hype, essentially. We mentioned that there is this almost hypnotic, maybe, I don't know, let's see what happens. Let's just see what happens, because we, in this case, this ephemeral we, don't believe that we will be personally affected, or if we will, it will be all right. Unfortunately, we see this quite a few as well with folks who are kind of downplaying what the return of Trump would mean in the US, for example. But believing that, I think, comes with a certain set of assumptions. As we mentioned before, those who say, well, let's see what happens with the Rassemblement National, have a certain set of assumptions about the country they live in, that they believe effectively can survive anything. That they will be here in 4 years, the country will be here in 4 years. Sure, things might change or be more difficult, but fundamentally, the things that we recognize here as France, for example, will stay. And if we don't, I'm saying we here, I don't see myself in that clique, but if we don't see what does that mean, what are the assumptions behind that, I think it puts us at a disadvantage if we are to take this threat very seriously. Now, as we said, there are many who don't take this threat seriously and maybe believe that they may even benefit in one way or another if the far right, for example, wins, because that means, for example, if you're a journalist and you know how to cover certain things and maybe you toe the line in a certain way, well, that might mean a decent career for you for the next 4 years. But that also comes with a certain assumption that they won't come after you. I will end on this. There is this concept in the kind of Arabic academia called tanfis. And it means, effectively just means letting air out, like how you would deflate a balloon. But it effectively politically means that from time to time in the Arab world, in the dictatorships, in Syria, the one I focus on, you will have some tolerance. This was before 2011 especially. You have some tolerance of certain specific demonstrations, certain specific protests, certain specific Palestine related or whatnot, because it was kind of believed in those circles that let them say something, let them kind of fash it, as we say now, let them let it out, and then they will come back, and we will tell them what the limits are for what's acceptable discourse, and this is how we would reassert our power. But what's kind of crucial about Tanfis is that sometimes it got out of hand. Sometimes the regime, let's say, would allow a protest in Syria and then essentially regret it because the protest would be free Palestine and also, by the way, free Syria. And that's something that they're not very happy with, of course. So what I'm saying with this is that people who are in positions of power, elites, mainstream, blah, 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 all of the folks that we've been talking about, they have lots of incentives on a day-to-day basis not to see certain things, not to focus too much on certain things, maybe not to see themselves as being particularly vulnerable if the far right wins, all of that, to tell themselves certain stories. And I think there's something empowering about recognizing that for those of us, and I'm speaking about myself here, who are not in those circles, who may even be victimized by some of those policies or many of those policies, there's a bit of a either power or at the very least understanding of my own agency in understanding that those people are not inevitable, in understanding that those people are not all-powerful, all-encompassing people who are just like this force of history, and I just need to find a way to escape. Because that's a bit often the conclusion that I see in a lot of my own circles of focusing on what they're saying, which I'm not saying we shouldn't, of course we should, but focusing on what the far right is saying and how the coverage has been so terrible in many of the ways we've been discussing here. And effectively the conclusion of our conversation would be we are fucked and we need to either find a way to leave or self-censor or whatnot. And I kind of, sometimes I feel that myself, I'm not gonna lie, but I think it's important to remind myself, as I'm trying to do here publicly to yourself and to listeners, that this is just not factually accurate. There are so many cases in history in which certain things that the people in power thought would happen just did not happen, or even became so bad for them that they had to quit politics, or some of them lost their lives or whatnot. And so I'll end on this hopefully hopeful note in the sense that I really genuinely believe, and not just because I want to believe, but I do think the facts bear that out, that the far right is not inevitable. The far right can be defeated. In order to be defeated, we do not have to appease the far right. Appeasement of the far right simply does not work, never has, literally not a single time, and it never will. And I'll end on that. But if you want to talk a bit about maybe what you're currently working on, or something that you want to focus on in the future, and let folks know if you're kind of present online in one way or another, where they can find you.
My most recent research has, I spanned quite a few things, but the things that I've been kind of quite excited about recently has been work that I've been doing on looking at the way really existing liberalism has been an enabler for reactionary politics. So I had an article that was published recently in Constellations, that's open access. And really this article is going to be kind of the basis of my new book project, which I hope to kind of submit towards the end of the year if everything goes to plan. So that's one of the things I've been doing. I've been doing some work that I'm really excited about with Fran Amery as well on transphobia, which I think has been really fascinating to kind of learn more about this, but also realize how easy it is for societies to kind of regress very, very quickly, and for communities to lose rights very, very quickly as well. One of the things as well that I'm very excited about, and that might be of interest to some of your listeners, is a new network that we created a couple of months ago, which is called the Reactionary Politics Research Network. You can find us at reactpol.net. You can find information there. It's in its infancy, but it's still kind of getting developed. If you want to join, you can. We are looking for people who are researching reactionary movements in a critical manner, which is in a way that seeks to kind of defeat these reactionary movements. We're not interested in sitting on the fence, and sitting in the middle between whether racism is good or bad or fascism is good or bad. So we are we are activist researchers, activist scholars, and we welcome researchers from beyond academic worlds as well. So, if you're doing research on reactionary politics in your communities, you're more than welcome to join and, access the resources we have, but also, participate in the various events we have as well, including the summer school that we are holding in early September.
Amazing. Well, on that note, Aurelien Mondon, thanks a lot for coming on again.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the Periphery that supports a bunch of media projects, including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.